All right, we're rolling.
All right, this is an interview at the Days Inn, Hicksville, New York, 16th of July, 2003, approximately 2:20 p.m. Interviewers are Mike Russert and Wayne Clark. Could you give me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Okay, Francis J. Simone, born July the 4th, 1921. That ought to get me a flag.
Yes.
And I was born in Saratoga Springs.
I noticed that, okay.
Yes.
Okay, so what was your educational background prior to entering service?
Well, I completed high school, and I completed funeral directing school in New York City. Mm-hmm. I was awaiting my chance to file for my New York State license, because in those days you had to be 21 to take your state boards. Oh, I was 20 when the war broke out, and being a 4th of July boy, I couldn't wait to get in. It was pretty difficult with my parents because being under 21, they had to sign for me. My father was a barber, and unfortunately he was shaving someone. When I went in, they asked him to sign for me. And I got chased down the street with a razor in his hand. Yeah, he said, if you want to die, I'll help you. You won't have to go into the service. Yeah, it was pretty rough.
Well, one question I want to go back to a little bit before you entered service. Do you recall where you were and your reaction when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Oh yes, very much so. I had gone to the movies that Sunday afternoon with my buddy, and after the movie we came to my house, and when we walked into the living room, my mother's sitting on the couch crying, and well, it was like going to a wake. We could tell immediately something was wrong. Nothing had been mentioned in the theater, and that's when I found out when I walked into my living room. Yeah.
Okay. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
I enlisted.
Okay. Now you selected the Army Air Force, Air Corps. Yeah. Why did you pick that?
Well, like many kids back in those days, flying just, was the thing. We had barnstormers come to Saratoga every summer, and I used to go out there with my bike, and if I had a couple of dollars, I'd talk the pilot into give me a ride.
Now, was that in the old biplane with the open cockpit?
No, this plane was, it was black, a cabin job, single engine, single wing, overhead wing. I forget what they called them in those days. It was the Cadillac of the airplanes. And I got friendly with this fellow, and I finally got to the point where I asked him if, he would take me up for a couple of dollars. Back then, that's about all I had. And subsequently, I think he flew me 2 or 3 times around the city. And it was in the summer when the races were on, so he would take me around the racetrack, and that was my first love. I used to read these magazines that had advertising about flying schools, out in Chicago and the Midwest, and I always thought I would just love to go to one. So when I had this opportunity, my first thought was apply for the cadets. Unfortunately, I was a half-inch too short. Yeah. And the sergeant was funny, who checked my size. I got up on my toes, and he says, you know, I'll put you down as 5'6", but when you get out west, they're going to catch you, and it's going to be more uncomfortable for you. So I says, okay, so I dropped back down to 5'5½", and I had to, you know, leave. I did take the test. I think I missed it by 2 or 3 points. And then I went for the physical after. So one way or the other, I would have been, you know, pushed out. I went right across the hall when I saw the sign, joined the Air Corps. I walked into the enlistment office and told him I wanted to enlist. He gave me the paperwork and says, bring them home to your parents, get them signed and get back. This was in Albany. And as I told you, I went home and my father didn't like it at all. But by the next day, we got him to, you know, back off a little bit. I convinced him that by going involuntarily, I could join the group I wanted to be with. And he wouldn't sign, though. My mother signed. Yeah.
Okay, where did you go for your training?
Well, initially, they sent us to Fort Dix. I was there about 4 days. They issued clothing. And then they trained us down to Langley Field, Virginia. Must have been about 500 of us that were taken down there. We left about 7 in the morning. We pulled into Langley Field about midnight.
What kind of training did you receive there?
Well, the second day that we got to Langley, we were all lined up outside this one hangar, single file, and when I finally got in, I found out what it was. There was a second lieutenant behind the desk, 2 sergeants sitting on tables, you know, on both sides, and the first thing I was asked was, how would you like to be a bombardier? You know, I was just awestruck, having no idea what was going to happen when I enlisted. I had no idea that I was going to be offered a flying position. So naturally, you know, I grabbed it. I found out later, the one sergeant, Sergeant English, he had been doing an awful lot of research with bombing submarines. I found out later this was an anti-submarine group at Langley Field. There were 3 squadrons, headquarters, 20th and the 96th. I was put into the 96th. The following morning, we were brought to a class, told exactly what bombing was all about, but we couldn't see the bomb site. Back then in '42, it was the biggest secret that our government had, the Northern bomb site. So they told us before we could see the site, we had to get recommendations from well-known citizens of our city, and then the FBI had to clear us. I still got copies of those letters at home. I was cleared, of course, as my parents were born here. Some of the fellows who were with us in that initial class were knocked down because their parents were of Italian birth. So just because of that, they were knocked down. About 2 weeks later, after those letters came back, because I called my dad up right away, I got one from the postmaster, one from the mayor, and one from the area director of the Internal Revenue Service, who was a family friend. So I had some pretty good, I think it was not even 2 weeks, my name was up for my first flight. I didn't know the first thing about airplanes, especially the B-17. We were flying YB-17s. They were part of the initial group that was built, because we had nothing. One of our planes was, they call it a ruptured duck. It was a Martin bomber. Before the B-17 was made, this was our heavy bomber. It was a 2-engine job. Looked horrible. But I went up in that before I went on a patrol. One of the fellas invited me to go with him on a bombing run. We had our own bombing area out there in the bay. And that's what we used to use. So I first went up in this, I think it was a B-25 Martin, I'm not sure. But then I went up in the YB-17, and back in those days the bombardier had to coordinate the electrical pots for the autopilot. I had no idea what it was, where to find it. But the pilot was very nice, young fella. He came down and he tried to make things pretty light for me. He says, I'm fairly new too. He says, let's look around. Well, the pot was on the left side with a plastic case. You had to lift the cover off, and there were 2 electrical pots in there. They had to be centered. And then when you threw the switch, they had to stay steady. Otherwise, the plane would take some sort of action. So we played around with that, and we finally got it. And that was my first experience. And then we continued the patrol. We patrolled the Atlantic approximately 7 hours, and we had specific routes to fly, looking for subs. And of course we found out later, as long as they heard a plane overhead, they kept down, because we would dive down to 1,500 feet, and we carried 3 dip charges, 375 pounders. So, if we caught them on the surface, we could do some pretty good damage. And that's how it started. While I was patrolling, I was going to class. We had what they called mechanical bomber. It was a metal affair. You hooked it up to power in the hangar, and there was a little bug that you set at different angles that would simulate wind drift. And then we'd have the bomb sight on this little affair, and we would have a bombing run. And that was our practice. And then, of course, when a plane was available, we'd go up on a practice bombing mission. We carried 100-pound practice bombs, and we would go after this target. The highest I ever flew that was on a bombing, not bombing, but a practice mission, was 7,000 feet. Because like I said, we only had about 3 planes in each squadron.
Mm-hmm.
And well, we didn't have much time for practice bombing. So we used the trainer, as they called it, most of the time for our experience and, you know, practice running.
Now, were you commissioned as an officer when you completed this?
No, we were all enlisted. And that was the funny part of it. We had no commissioned bombardiers at that time. Sergeant English was head of the group. He would give us talks occasionally, and then we found out that they were issuing a bombardier wing. So we went to the PX and got the wings.
Mm-hmm.
Because we felt we were qualified. We were patrolling, and a short time later, it was around summertime of '42, this first lieutenant bombardier came to our field, and he happened to be in town and saw a couple of the fellas with the bombardier wings. All hell broke loose. Yeah, he said, "You have no right to wear that wing. You can wear the, what do they call it?
Your crewman?
The crew member wing.
Mm-hmm.
But you cannot wear the bombardier wing." Well, that caused a lot of problems because we went in and spoke to our squadron commander and thought it was very unfair that we were not allowed to wear those wings. We had gone through all the training. We had bombed, you know, in the training area. We were patrolling for hundreds of hours. In fact, after about 3 weeks, we were forced to take 36-hour passes because they found that the drone of those engines were putting us to sleep. I mean, we carried loads of coffee, strong as could be, to try and stay awake.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, my being up in the front, you know, I heard those engines going constantly. I think our group, the bombardier trainees, had more time off during wartime because of that. You know, they would tell us, you know, get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I had a couple of furloughs. And anyway, I flew for just about a year. And then we got orders to ship out. And we were told, all the bombardiers, the enlisted bombardiers, we were told that we had a choice. We could apply for a cadet school where we would become commissioned bombardiers, or we could elect to take another job as a member of the flying crew. I had this one officer who was head of the radio department, very nice fellow, tried to talk me into becoming a radio operator. And I was a bit pig-headed.
Mm-hmm.
I felt I had been training and flying for a year. And for me to waste another 6 months to become a commissioned officer wouldn't have made me any better as a bombardier. I just refused it. In wartime, they didn't argue with us. They allowed us to take whatever we wanted. I said, well, I'll go in the bomb sight shop. If you won't let me fly the way I was trained, I don't want to fly at all. Well, they moved us up to Newfoundland, Gander Field. And they gave us B-24s, where before we had had 17s. I went into S2, where we mapped the routes for the patrols. And I stayed in S2 while we were in Newfoundland. Just to break the monotony, I guess, I put my name down as an observer on one of the flights. Wouldn't you believe we hit a fog and we hit the northern lights? We got lost. And the funny thing about it, I probably shouldn't say this, but by this time our planes had radar. We had the Loran system that England had developed. Our navigators were getting a little bit lazy. You know, they figured, hell, we just set the radar and home in on the signal. So this particular day, our navigator did not take his sextant. Took none of his equipment. So when the pilot said, get a fix so we know where we're heading, he says, I can't, I didn't bring anything. So we got up above the fog, got the moon, the northern star, and with the whole bunch of us, we decided which way was west and south, because we were up off Greenland at the time. And we headed back. Well, our radar went out because of the northern lights. The radar we couldn't receive, but our radio operator kept sending Mayday. And we just kept flying above the fog and, you know, watching the moon. And the pilot said, you fellas better get your chutes on, because when we run out of gas, we're going to have to jump. So we jettisoned, you know, the B-24, it had this square door on the bottom of the plane. And we jettisoned that. Me being the smallest guy, they said, Simone, you go first. We handed out maps, whatever we had, and we're just all looking down. This is all the enlisted crew. And it seemed everybody hollered at one time, there's concrete. So we called up to the pilot and he says, yeah, we saw it. What do you want to do? We said, look, take a chance. If we drop in the ocean, what do we got, 20 minutes to North Atlantic? We said, let's take a chance. So he circled, and of course coming down through the fog, he couldn't see what was happening. But anyway, we got down. We landed in this cow pasture. And once we got out of the plane, it seemed to be a joke, because right off the left wing, this cow was grazing. This is about 2 o'clock in the morning. What we had seen was an emergency runway that was built up on the coast of Maine for just such eventualities. So planes coming in had a place to land. So we missed the runway, but we came down in the cow pasture. We fractured one of the struts. Not too bad, but we could see a hairline crack. By the time we got out of the plane, no, before that, when we got out of the plane, we saw this little shack, a couple of 100 yards away from us. There was a light in it. So we headed for this shack. when we got close enough, we saw this girl in the doorway crying her head off. Are you all right? Are you all right? It seems she was taking care of this radio station for just such emergencies. And she says, I could hear your mayday, but I couldn't get through to you. So she says, I got in touch with New York. First headquarters was in New York at the time. She says, I told them I heard you. I knew where you were, but that I couldn't speak to you. And then she said she woke up the mayor, the postmaster, the police chief, and we're out in this field. And by that time we see this line of cars, must have been 20 cars, you know, all coming down this road. They finally got to us. They also brought the National Guard with them because we had been carrying a secret torpedo. It was a homing torpedo. And they thought we still had it. But when we thought we were going to crash, we dropped it where we thought was the Gulf of St. Lawrence. We never heard anything about it, so evidently nobody got hurt. But the local soldiers put a guard around our plane. They took us into the village. The only hotel, Millinocket, Maine, was the village. It was a paper mill town. And the girl had told us, when I saw you circling, I cried my head off because the paper mill had this smokestack. She says, when I saw you circling, I knew you were going to hit it. But as luck would have it, we just about skirted the darn thing when we came in. So they brought us to the only hotel in town. They woke up the chef, fed us anything we wanted, and you know, coming from which was overseas, we had basic food, so we ordered steak and eggs. So we were there for a week until they sent a crew from Millinocket, Maine in a C-46 to check our plane. They felt that we could take off with it and get down to Millinocket, Maine. So, like I said, just about 7-8 days, we finally took off, and the whole town came out to wave us goodbye. And we got down to Millinocket, and our pilot was called in to headquarters, and then he came back out to us and he says, get your butts back in the plane. We're ordered back to Gander Field right away. So we got in the plane. What we didn't find out till later was that they had gotten shipping orders, and we were to leave the next day. So we flew up to Gander, and while we were in Millinocket, we talked the local liquor store man into selling us some liquor. So here we are going back up there with liquor, and we got to leave the next day. So you can understand that night we had some party up in our barracks. And the next morning they put us on one of these tuner, what do they call them? Tuner trains, the local train up there that circled the whole island. And they brought us down to Argencia, where we got on a flat bottom boat, and they brought us down to Camp Kilmer. We stayed in Camp Kilmer for about 10 days while we waited for shipping overseas. In the meantime, they had taken all our 24s. So the whole squadron, the whole group was together. And we stayed there for about a little over a week. And of course, there was nobody but the second in command in the office, no first sergeant. We just had to find our own bunk someplace. It was very unorganized. But we did find a couple of pads of passes. And it was strange how the commander signed all these passes. So we went into New York every night. The last night, when we finally got word, you better be here tomorrow morning. So that night we're all gathered at Penn Station. And who shows up but our adjutant? And he looked around and he says, "It was nice that you boys were able to get passes. Who signed them?" But anyway, we got back to camp, and the next morning they took us over to Staten Island. And we got on this big ship that had been captured from the Germans in the First World War. It was the Washington. We had about 10,000 guys on that ship. When my group and myself went down to find our, not a bunk, it was a hammock, that's all. We were so far below the water level, we said, "The hell with this." We got blankets, went back up to the promenade deck for 11 days, because we were all non-coms at that time. We all stayed up on the promenade deck all the way across. And we finally landed in Liverpool.
Did you go across alone, or was it in a convoy?
Oh, we had a convoy. We had one of these makeshift aircraft carriers. The poor guys on that thing, it was bouncing all over the ocean. No, we had a tanker, we had destroyers with us. Yeah, we had a full convoy. Yeah. So we got into Liverpool late in the afternoon, and the Germans were bombing Liverpool. So they backed us out into the ocean again to get us away from there. And then we came back in the following morning, and they put us on a train, took it all the way down to Exeter, southern England. And that's where we stayed for about a month as anti-sub patrol over the Bay of Biscay. The thought was that we could hit the U-boats as they were coming into France for refueling. But I wasn't flying anymore at that point. While we were still in Newfoundland, I was on duty, but I got word that all of the air crews from Langley Field were ordered to get out in first class uniform because General Acre was coming up there. We found out later, if we flew over 1,200 hours of patrol, he was issuing us the Air Medal. So I got my Air Medal. Yeah. And like I said, once we got to England, I went into the bomb sight shop. They gave me another stripe, so I was now a staff sergeant. And the rest of the war, I stayed as a bomb sight and autopilot technician. I would go up occasionally when the system was being overhauled just to check it out on a transition flight. But I never did enough flying after that to get any flying pay, because you had to fly 4 hours to get flying pay.
Were the bomb sites, did they need much work on them, or?
No, No, it was a beautiful piece of equipment. And unfortunately, when the war ended over there, we were told to take our whole supply from the shop, because every plane had two sets. One set would be overhauled while the other was in the plane, and then we would switch them every 100 hours when the plane was put down. Then we would change our equipment. We had to truck all this stuff over to a pit, was about 20 feet deep, and dump them. So they would all be, well, by that time, the Germans had the northern side anyway. It was very simple, but it was a wonderful piece of equipment, and it did a good job.
So you think those sites are there today, under 20 feet of dirt?
They could be. In fact, Elkinberry is still bare. The air base where I was at, the British have it now, but there's a plaque up. A friend of mine went over and took a picture of it. A plaque for the 482nd Pathfinder Bomb Group. Because of our experience with the radar, they put us up in the Midlands where all the heavy bombers were, and we would lead the different bomb wings over into Germany, so that if there was cloud cover with the radar, they could see what the target was. And that's about the gist of it.
Okay, so you stayed over there until basically the end of the war?
I stayed there till the war ended. Right after the end of the war, they flew all the 17s and 24s back home. And they took a lot of the ground crews, support groups as they call them, and I was one of them. So I flew home with the planes. We landed in Iceland, stayed overnight, refueled, came down to Labrador, refueled, and then we gave up our planes in Windsor Locks, Connecticut. And the plane, you could almost walk on them. We were one right after the other. So we stayed there for one day. Then they shipped us up to Massachusetts to another base. And then they brought us down to Fort Dix, where they gave us a 30-day leave. They said, you fellas can go home, relax, but you've got to be back here the 5th of July, 45, because we're going to go and fight the Japs. So, of course, while we were on our furlough, we met some of the ground crews that had come home by ship. They were being discharged right off the gangplank. And that caused a lot of hell, because we had a lot of points. We were told we would be discharged according to points. Well, with my having 4 years in, and the air medal, and a lot of this other stuff, I had about 130 some odd points, like a lot of the other fellas. We should have been let out first. And here we meet the ground crews, office personnel, who were discharged right off the ship. So when we got out to California, Needles, California, we just about ripped that theater up. There were 1,500 of us that were called in by the general. He had been our squadron commander at Langley Field. And by the end of the war, he became a general. So he gets up on the stage explaining why we're so important. You wouldn't believe it. I wasn't strong enough, but guys ripped the seats out of the floor and threw them at him up on the stage. They called out the MPs, marches back to the barracks, and we're told, don't you leave here. We'll pick you up at mealtime to calm us down. Oh, it was really hell. It was really hell. Well, finally they felt that they couldn't contain us. They split us into 3 groups. My group was shipped down to Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. One group went to Texas, and the other group went to someplace else in Arizona. But with 3 different troop trains, they spread us out. On the way down to Arizona, you know, we had to stop at different places for food. And we picked up the paper and we saw the headline, atomic bomb dropped. Mm-hmm. So before we got to Arizona, we knew the war was over. But we still had to stay for 2 weeks before they got our paperwork squared away. A buddy and myself were hanging out together. And after about 4 days, we got notified by the CQ, get over to the bomb site department, the captain wants to see you. Up until this time, you know, there was no directive. I was having lunch with my first sergeant in the non-commissioned officers club. You know, out there in Arizona, we were having steak every day. We knew nothing about what was going on. So George and I go over to the bomb site department. This big, stocky captain, young guy, sitting behind the desk. And the whole crew is sitting against the wall. And they're all snickering. So we walk in and identify ourselves. And he starts blasting the hell out of us. Just because you were overseas, you think that you deserve special privilege? And oh, he was giving us holy hell. You're going to be on the night shift. You report 7 o'clock at night, and you'll be working till 7 in the morning. Now out there we got B-29s. I had never seen one before. George hadn't either. So we report at 7 o'clock at night. Nobody's there. But on the blackboard, our names, take plane so-and-so out and swing the compass. Well, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. So we says, well, we went out, we found the plane, a B-29. So we said, now how the hell do we get it almost a mile down the runway where this circle was, where we could swing the compass? Because they had a compass about this big in the nose of the 29, and it had to be checked every so often. Well, we went and we found one of these tow trucks. Because, you know, I knew what they were for and how to hook them up. So we hooked this thing up to the nose wheel, and I'm sitting up on top of the wing looking for planes while George is towing me. And, you know, I'm worried that some damn plane's going to come in and we're going down the runway. Well, we found out later nobody was flying anyway. But, you know, this is what we were put through. Well, we got down there, we swung the compass, we came back. The next day, we got orders to change all the autopilot equipment. Now, each section has a motor affair that controls either the ailerons, the rudder, you know, different sections. We were told to take these damn things out of the plane and replace them with others. We had no equipment, because you know, once these things are set in, then you have a gauge that checks the tension of the guide cables. We had none of this. So we said, we're going to play it smart. We unscrewed the identification labels from each piece and switched them with the ones in the plane. And that was safer than our taking the equipment out of a plane and then sending the plane up, and God forbid if the pilot tried to put his autopilot on and those cables didn't have the right tension, he could have gone into a dive and killed his whole crew. Mm-hmm. So amongst ourselves, we thought this was the safest thing to do. Fortunately, it was only about 4 days, and we got orders up on the bulletin board that we would be leaving to go back to Fort Dix for discharge. So we had, you know, crazy kids. We said, why the hell do we have to wait for a troop train? If we can get our pay, we can go back by bus. Because we'd go into Phoenix and see these New York Express buses. So we go into the finance department, and there's a few whacks there. And I start talking to this one gal. Lo and behold, she comes from Corinth. You know where Corinth is?
Yep.
So I said, hey, we're buddies, you know. So she made up the paperwork. We got our money. So we took the bus into town, this other fella and I. We waiting for the bus. Finally comes in, and the bus driver said, I got a full load, fellas. I don't know if I got room for you. So he said, but wait here. Well, the bus was loaded with women. You know, after all, war, it was still wartime, so to speak, anyway. And we're standing there by the door, and all the women come back to the bus. It was one of their relief stops. So once they all got on the bus, the driver got in there and he says, ladies, those 2 soldiers you saw want to go to New York, and I don't have any room. And they start screaming, sit them on our laps. So we both got on the bus, and we drove back to Pittsburgh. By that time, I had had it up to here. And we stopped at Pittsburgh and found out there was a train for New York in a half hour. We said goodbye. We got on the train, got into New York. I was 3 days ahead of the schedule of reporting to Fort Dix. And, of course, I was engaged at the time. So I was spending all the time in the Bronx. And then I went to Dix. I think it took over a week to find my papers. I don't know what happened, but the fact that I wasn't on the troop train, they just put my papers someplace, and it took, pardon me, a whole week to find my papers before I got discharged. And I finally got out. And that's my story, fellas.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to remember, so I took these were all,
The medals.
I even got a Normandy medal. You know, they've been sending so many medals over every year to those who were involved. And even though my group was on the bombing raid that morning, you know, of the invasion, I was on a 3-day pass. But I joined the 8th Air Force Historical Society, and they put my name in.
So you were considered 8th Air Force?
Oh yeah, we were 8th Air Force.
Okay.
Oh yes.
All right. Okay. Did you do you remember where you were and if you had any reaction at the time to the death of President Roosevelt?
Oh yes. Well, we were all in bed. They got us up around 2 o'clock in the morning when they got word over there. Everybody had a fallout, and they announced that the president had died. And then they go on back to bed. But yeah, no, I was in my Quonset hut at Alconbury. Yeah.
What was your reaction when you heard about the dropping of the atomic bombs?
Well, not knowing too much about it, the only connection we had was that the war's over. And naturally it was quite a bit of elation amongst the whole group of people, you know, on the troop train.
Did you ever make use of the GI Bill?
Yes. I bought 2 houses. Bought one up in Saratoga right after I got married. And then I sold that to another veteran. I came down to New York. I lived in the Bronx for about 4 years. And then I bought a house out on Long Island where I live now and used the GI Bill for that. I had the crazy idea one time that I wanted to be a beautician. This is after I'm a funeral director. So I used a little bit of it at that time. But that didn't last long. I couldn't stand it.
Did you ever use the 5220 Club at all?
No, damn it. Well, you know, my father was in business all his life in Saratoga. We had the funeral home because my brother and I started the funeral home in 1936. So I was the little guy, you know, clean up around the place. Well, when I got back from service, I said, the fellas are going down and collecting. I'm going to go down. My father says, you want to embarrass me? They know you're working here at the funeral home. But you know, we weren't doing that much business. We were the low men on the totem pole. There were 3 funeral homes with over 50 years service. And we were lucky to do 20, 30 calls a year. So I could have used an extra buck. But no.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I belong to the VFW. I belong to the DAV. You may want to hear this story. It's stupid, but it shows what can happen. When I went to Fort Dix, I weighed 128 pounds. I was 5'5½". I wore a size 7 shoe, 7A. When I went for my clothes, you know, I had this all marked down. And this corporal said to me, when you're carrying a backpack, your feet are going to get bigger. Here. And he throws me a pair of shoes. I didn't know what it was. In fact, being in 2 days, you were scared silly of asking questions. Well, I started wearing them. Like I said, we were in Fort Dix about 4 days. This was in January. Muddy as hell. And all we did was odd jobs. But when I got down to Virginia, while we're waiting to get clearance from the FBI, they got us out drilling. Well, then I realized these damn shoes, I can't wear them. They're so big. He gave me a size 8D.
Oh boy.
You've read about these cartoons where the guy can make an about face and his feet don't move? Well, this went on for a couple of months. And I was afraid to change shoes, but the shoes were hurting me. And I would go to the supply sergeant every couple of weeks. And he'd say, Frank, I can't do anything for you. I need a special order. I can't change your shoes. Come April, I'll never forget it, Holy Week, before Easter, we had a contingent from Washington come down to issue awards. Some of the crew chiefs who were with the initial B-17s who flew to Argentina in '32 were at Langley Field. So they felt this was a good time to issue them awards. So naturally, the whole base gets called out. Class A's, the band comes out. Little me is in the front row for inspection. And the base commander decides to come over and inspect our squadron. And he looks at me. By this time, my feet were killing me. So I sent home for my regular brown shoes. So I'm wearing my damn brown Oxfords. And he looks and he said, "Those aren't GI." I said, "No, sir." "Why?" I said, "Because I can't wear what I was issued." "What are you talking about?" Calls over the adjutant. "Find out what the hell's going on with this guy." He said, "Simone, see me right after the parade." We had the parade and all that baloney. Come back. I go in to his office. He said, "What the hell happened?" So I told him. Took me over to supply. The sergeant says, "Lieutenant, I know what you're going to say. Simone's been after me for months now." And I told him I cannot reissue him another size. "Well, GD, I'm going to give you the order now." Okay. 5 years later, I'm home. In those days, funeral homes supplied ambulance service in the small towns. So my brother had gotten the VA contract with the group that was at the bats, because a lot of fellas coming back with rheumatoid arthritis and so forth were given bats. So I was having trouble. I just couldn't seem to hold anything in my hand. So my brother says, "Go down and see Dr. So-and-so." So I went down to Waterville, where the headquarters was. They examined me, and they said, "Okay, get dressed, go on back home." I go back home. A couple of weeks later, I get a letter. We find that you have, it was in Latin, meaning flat feet. We found that this was because of a situation in the service. If you wish to follow it, contact so-and-so. And I did, and I got it. And I'm a DAV, but I wasn't injured. It wasn't through enemy action. Ain't that stupid?
Yes. How do you think, besides your feet, how do you think your service affected your life?
I think it helped me. It helped me. I was a little kid in a small town. I felt trapped. To me, it's stupid maybe, but to me the war was an outlet. Absolutely. And once I went in service, I met this young lady from the Bronx. I'd have never met her otherwise. And I still got her.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Even though she's in the nursing home. But anyway.